Scotland and to make this as much a home as it possibly can be. Thank you.
Many thanks. And that concludes the members' business debate on support for Syrian refugees. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 9051 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on Stage 1 of the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And I now call on Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to speak to and move the motion when you are ready. 14 minutes, Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am very pleased to open the debate this afternoon on the general principles of the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. I want to begin by thanking all those who gave evidence to the committee. I am particularly grateful to Maureen Watt, the convener of the committee, and to all of the members of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee for very detailed scrutiny of the bill at stage 1. I am pleased that the committee has recognised the efforts made to consult on the bill from its conception and throughout its development, and I very much welcome their clear recommendation to the Parliament that the general principles of the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill be agreed to. The Government is, of course, as the Chamber would expect us to be, giving serious consideration to the detail of the committee's report, and I will respond to its key points in due course and, of course, in light of today's debate and the points that I have no doubt will be made throughout the debate this afternoon. As all of us know, and as was commented on at length when the Parliament last had the opportunity to debate public procurement, public bodies in Scotland spend round about £10 billion every year buying things. So it stands to reason that the decisions public bodies make when they spend that money are going to be of enormous importance to businesses, to third sector organisations and indeed to the health of our economy as a whole. That's why the Procurement Reform Bill is both necessary and I think very important. But before I go on to say a bit more about the content of the bill, the main provisions of the bill itself, I think it's also important to stress, and this point was made by a number of members when we last debated this issue, that the bill doesn't sit in isolation. It is not the be-all and end-all of the work we are doing and require to do on procurement. The bill forms part of the bigger programme of reform that was embarked upon in Scotland following the publication of John McClelland's Review of Public Procurement report, which was published back in 2006. That programme has led to the development of what is increasingly referred to as the Scottish model of procurement, which seeks to maximise the contribution that public procurement can make to our economic prosperity. That approach to procurement sees procurement as an integral part of policy development and service delivery, not something that sits to the side, but something that is integral to the whole process. It looks very much at outcomes, not outputs. It uses the power of public spend to deliver genuine public value in purchasing. The value for money triangle, cost, quality, sustainability, is central to that model of procurement, and economic, social and environmental sustainability must be at the heart of that and must be at the heart of all we do around procurement. And sustainability is certainly at the heart of the Procurement Reform Bill. As members, particularly those in the committee, will be well aware, the aim of the bill is to set a framework for public procurement that is both business-friendly and socially responsible. Business-friendly by standardising process, streamlining bureaucracy, increasing transparency and encouraging innovation, something that was commented on at length in the committee. And also socially responsible by looking at the broader economic and social implications of procurement decisions, and I'll come back to some of that later in my speech. Yes.
Scott.
Cabinet Secretary for giving way. She mentioned transparency as part, I think, of her triangle of best value. Would she agree, therefore, that in taking forward this bill, the hub-core structure that is now such an essential part of delivering new projects across Scotland should be included in the measures of this bill so as to ensure the transparency that I'm sure across this chamber we all seek?
I think we all want to see that. I'll come on later on to talk about the scope of the bill in terms of the bodies that are covered. But absolutely, I think hubs are an increasingly important part of the landscape of capital infrastructure and development. It is absolutely important that they comply with the principles that are so important to ensure that we've got a transparent framework around what we do. I was going on to talk a little bit about the importance of building in considerations like community and environmental benefits at the start of the procurement process, not as last-minute considerations. I would also say that setting clear standards for the conduct of public procurement and clear standards of business ethics is also very important. So the bill will help us accelerate improvements in the system and help ensure that, especially on major contracts, we maximise the contribution from our procurement spending, whether that's economic, social or environmental value. The bill places some general duties on public bodies in terms of their procurement activities. Those duties are about acting without discrimination and in a transparent manner, and also in a way that is best designed to improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the area in which the body operates and to promote innovation. It will also require bodies to consider how they can facilitate the involvement of SMEs, the third sector and supported businesses in their procurement activities. These duties are particularly important as it is at the pre-procurement stage that public bodies have the greatest scope to ensure that procurement is accessible, particularly to smaller businesses, and that it delivers maximum social, environmental and economic value. Supporting these general duties are a number of specific duties. One of these will require public bodies to consider including community benefit clauses in all new major public sector contracts, and where they are not appropriate, to explain why they are not appropriate in the contract notice. And that will help maximise benefits from public procurement and build on our already good track record in recent years of delivering training and employment through contracts. Other specific duties contained in the bill will help to tackle unnecessary inconsistencies for suppliers doing business with the public sector, and will help to ensure that doing business with the public sector can be simple, transparent and more accessible to suppliers. Again, I would specifically mention SMEs. So, for example, we have a requirement for public bodies to advertise contracts using the single online portal. That will improve the visibility and the transparency of contracts and ensure that there is a one-stop shop for suppliers seeking to do business with the public sector. There's the placing of a requirement on contracting authorities that have a high level of spend to prepare and publish corporate procurement strategies and annual reports, and it's by standardising the approach to these principles that will help support better information, increase transparency and visibility, and provide a better basis for engagement and hopefully remove unnecessary inconsistencies. There will also be a requirement on contracting authorities to maintain a contracts register and also to make it publicly available. Again, that's about transparency, but it's also about helping business in assessing current spend areas and identifying potential future opportunities. There will be... yes.
Transparency is obviously welcome, but will she do something about the fundamental problem about the size of contracts, which excludes SMEs from bidding in many cases in the first place?
Well, Malcolm Chisholm will be aware of some provisions of the bill around, I think it's around section 24, about issuing guidance that will help in terms of the selection of tenderers. And we are very clear that this bill should be part of a process of removing unnecessary barriers to businesses from bidding for and trying to access public contracts. So, for example, one of the specific points in the bill is around charging for tender documents, for example. So, these are very much key issues in the bill. And, of course, as we go into stage 2, the government, as we always are, will be open to any looking at any amendments that improve that even further. I was coming on to talk about charging for tender documents, but since I've done that in response to Malcolm Chisholm, I don't need to do that. That will obviously help to eradicate what is a poor practice that does act as a serious barrier and disproportionately affects smaller firms and third sector bodies. The bill will also set standards for the provision of debrief information, which is an important part of procurement activity because it helps suppliers understand where they might have weaknesses and also look at where they can improve. Using the bill to promote this kind of standardisation and improved procedures will help to improve value for money, and it will also reduce costs for businesses. High-quality public procurement is not only dependent on good practice by contracting authorities and the purchasers, of course, but also by suppliers to the public sector. They've got to play their part by delivering high-quality, cost-effective goods and services and by maintaining the highest possible business ethics and standards. So the bill helps us, will allow us to set rules where they... Yep.
James Kelly.
I thank the Deputy First Minister for giving way. Just on the issue of business ethics, does the Deputy First Minister not acknowledge that it's an omission in the bill that there's no inclusion of the living wage to give an opportunity to lift many low-paid workers out of the lower wage brackets?
I'm coming on to talk about that. I don't accept it as an omission from the bill. I think we have gone as far in the bill as we can within the confines of European law, although this is a debate we will have through the different stages of the bill. But I was coming on to talk about these issues in general, because the bill allows us to set rules where they don't currently exist within the overarching European legislation regarding both the selection and the exclusion of companies as part of tendering exercises. So the practice of blacklisting, failure to comply with obligations on tax and other acts of professional misconduct could in future result in a company being judged unsuitable to bid, and rightly so. And let me put on record again today the Scottish Government, and I know the whole Parliament's view, that blacklisting as a practice is completely and utterly unacceptable. There's also been discussion, which James Kelly has alluded to there in the context of this bill, about the living wage, something that this Government is absolutely committed to and is leading by example on. As I've explained before, EU law, and it's not procurement law, it's the law around posted workers, does not allow us to make it an absolute requirement of contracts. However, the bill does allow us to issue guidance on workforce-related issues. That means we can make sure that where they're relevant to the delivery and performance of a contract, issues such as how much a company, well, if you just let me finish, how much a company pays its staff, or whether it makes, for example, inappropriate use of zero-hour contracts, these are things that can be taken into account. So we are determined to use this bill to the maximum. As I say, these are discussions we'll have at stage 2, but I'm sure all members will accept that we have to remain within the confines of European law. I'll take a brief intervention and then I have to make progress because I've been generous.
In terms of the guidance, if I'm an employer who does not want to pay the living wage, what's to stop me ignoring the guidance and putting it in the bin?
Cabinet Secretary.
What we're doing in the bill is giving statutory underpinning to guidance, and we have not only led by example as a government and through the public sector in terms of the living wage. We're currently funding the Poverty Alliance to do work to raise awareness of and promote the living wage within the private sector. On this issue, I would hope that whatever else divides us, we can actually accept that James Kelly and I are on the same side here. We want to see the living wage paid. This is about how we do that best through this bill, but accepting that it won't just be done through this bill. There's a whole range of things we need to do. So I would hope we could work constructively together on this rather than making it a point of division. I have mentioned European law on a couple of occasions. Obviously, we require here to maintain consistency with existing legislation where there's commonality. We don't want unnecessary complexity or to give rise to confusion, so we've chosen to mirror the 2012 regulations while limiting the bill's application to Scottish public bodies. Application of the 2012 regulations is well understood, and the approach we've taken means that if a Scottish contracting authority is already within scope of them, it will also be within scope of the bill. Of course, we recognise that in the case of some types of contract, health and social care contracts, contracts which universities and colleges need to award in support of research and development, special circumstances apply, and I indicated previously, and will do so again today, that we intend to lodge amendments at stage 2 that will respond to some of the concerns that have been expressed in that regard. Like the committee and many members, I've heard a lot of discussion about the types of issue that the bill should address and how it should address these issues. I've already commented on some of the constraints we operate within. What was recognised in the Chamber and through the committee stages that this bill can't be a panacea for all procurement ills, but we do want to use it to the maximum to make as much progress as possible. And taken together, I think the package of measures within this bill does strike an appropriate balance in responding to the views that have been expressed, while retaining the flexibility to cover the diverse range of goods, services and works that are procured by the public sector. I want to just briefly mention before I finish that this bill shouldn't be seen in isolation within Scotland, nor should it be seen in isolation within the European Union. Just last week, the Council of the EU adopted 3 new public procurement directives, and we intend to implement the directives by summer next year, well ahead of the deadline for transposition set out in the directives. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I think making procurement spending work better has enormous potential for our economic, social and environmental well-being. I think this bill, while it's not the panacea that some have thought it might be, is an important part of the overall package, because it can help ensure that we remain at the vanguard of innovative public procurement and help get the best outcomes for Scotland. So I hope that the Parliament agrees today the general principles of the bill, and I move that they do so, but indicate in doing so that I remain very happy to work with members as we progress to stage 2 and look favourably on amendments that come forward.
Many thanks. I now call on Maureen Watt to speak to on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee as well. Maureen Watt, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the Stage 1 debate on the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. I would firstly like to thank all those who provided written and oral evidence to the committee, and I'd also like to thank all the people from businesses, the public sector and third sector organisations who gave of their time to attend informal events or to meet informally with the committee, as well as those who gave evidence formally to the committee. I'd also like to thank the committee clerks who had to put in a tremendous amount of work in terms of making sure that everyone had their chance to have a say. I'd also like to thank fellow committee members for their input, and to members of other committees that considered the bill at stage 1. The Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee supports the general principles of the bill. It considers that legislation is required to improve the situation of those attempting to access public contracts. And, as it has stated in its report, the committee considers that the National Procurement Framework for Scotland established by the bill will improve consistency and transparency. As the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned in her opening remarks, the committee is aware that the bill was drafted within the context of current European legislation and in advance of new directives on procurement. The committee recognises the need for a level of flexibility in the bill so that it can react to these directives. On balance, the committee is supportive of the drive for procurement reform in Scotland at this time, but it will monitor how the bill ultimately sits with the upcoming directives. Part 1 of the bill sets out the contracting authorities to which the bill's provisions must apply and the types of contract it will regulate. The committee was generally content with the approach taken, but heard in evidence the arguments for the inclusion of Scottish Water. The committee understands the logic of Scottish Water sitting as it does with existing utilities legislation on procurement, rather than within this bill. However, the committee asked the Scottish Government to respond to the argument that there is benefit in bringing Scottish Water into the scope of the bill for its smaller contracts. The committee also considered the issue of arm's-length external organisations, or ALIOs as they are commonly known. The committee asked the Scottish Government to consider how it might ensure that all ALIOs are covered by the provisions of the bill, and I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could make remarks on this point during her closing speech. The committee heard extensive evidence on the sustainability procurement duty. The inclusion of this duty has been welcomed in evidence. Any criticism that the committee heard centred on the duty not being onerous enough or not sufficiently extended to cover specific policy areas. The committee highlighted the need for extensive and robust guidance on the procurement strategies and annual procurement reports to support the sustainable procurement duty. The committee also sought information on how the Scottish Government might use the procurement strategies and annual reports to assess the application of the sustainable procurement duty. And that obviously will be taken forward at future stages. The sustainable procurement duty applies to contracts of £50,000 or more for goods and services and £2 million for public works. The lowering of the current thresholds was broadly supported in evidence. In advance of the operation of these thresholds, it is difficult for the committee to reach a view based on evidence. In the light of this, the committee agreed to support the approach taken by the Scottish Government to balance the threshold amounts with proportionality. It welcomes the Cabinet Secretary's undertaking to keep the matter under review and welcomes the power at Section 3.3 of the Bill, which will allow the threshold amounts to be amended in line with experience if necessary. Contracting authorities must also consider community benefit provisions for contracts worth £4 million and above. This was broadly welcomed by the business organisations, the third sector, public authorities and individuals. In a similar vein, the sustainable procurement duty the committee considered that the monitoring of the community benefit requirement was of substantial importance. It was brought to the committee's attention that whilst procurement strategies must include community benefit information, there was no requirement for this to feature in the annual procurement reports. The committee would therefore like the bill to ensure that annual procurement reports include contracts that have community benefit provisions so that the outcomes can be assessed. The opportunity to include provisions on supported businesses and social enterprises in the community benefit requirement was also raised in evidence and has been highlighted by the committee. The success of the community benefit requirement rests heavily on guidance, and the committee requested further information on some of the detail to be included in the guidance, and I would welcome comments from the Cabinet Secretary on that. The issue of the living wage was explored throughout the committee's evidence taking. We were advised that correspondence between the European Commission and the Scottish Government indicates that a provision on the living wage would be likely to conflict with the Posting of Workers Directive. The Scottish Government takes the view that this is unable to include a mandatory requirement in the bill on the living wage due to the views of the Commission. The committee noted the Scottish Government's position on this, but given the extent to which the encouragement of the living wage will rest within guidance, we sought clarification on how this would be addressed. The bill also includes provisions covering guidance on the exclusion of tenderers. It is the committee's understanding that these provisions will allow the Scottish Government to address some of the issues around blacklisting via regulations made under the bill. This was an important issue raised in evidence, and the committee welcomes the Scottish Government's ongoing dialogue with the trade unions on this point. Yeah.
Finlay.
Can I ask?
Microphone for Mr. Finlay, please.
Can I ask what would happen if an employer ignored the guidance?
Sorry,
Member well knows.
Yeah.
The committee heard repeatedly of the need for transparency in public contracts. It therefore welcomes the requirement for contract notices and award notices to be published on the Public Contracts website. The committee considers that this provision is essential to improving access and transparency. The committee supports the establishment of a revenues regime under the bill. However, we heard evidence to support the establishment of an ombudsman or tribunal system to accompany this, and we understand that whilst the bill does not deal with this issue directly, there will be an opportunity for the Scottish Government to consider this issue when new European directives are adopted. The committee intends to monitor the Scottish Government's considerations in this area. The committee also heard in evidence the importance of developing the skills of procurement professionals and the contribution this could make towards delivering improvements in the public procurement process. Evidence from the Accounts Commission and the Auditor-General for Scotland pointed out that public bodies will be required to demonstrate how their procurement will promote and improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of their areas. They considered that this and other aspects will require fresh thinking and may require training in new approaches to managing procurement. The committee invited the Scottish Government to consider and respond to the recommendation that training and development of staff is included as a requirement in the procurement strategy and annual procurement report guidance. Informal discussion with the third sector and SMEs also indicated that awareness raising and support for them was important, and the committee asks for a response from the Scottish Government on this issue. The committee welcomed the commitment by the Scottish Government to pursue opportunities to drive greener public procurement and to expand the market for recycled and recyclable materials, and we support the provisions at section 31 of the bill. We also welcome the undertakings to take forward FOI matters in discussion with the Scottish Information Commissioner, and I don't know whether the Cabinet Secretary can give an update on that. Two other important concerns with the bill were brought to the committee's attention, and the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned those in her speech. Firstly, the committee was alerted to issues surrounding the procurement of health and social care. And the second area of concern, which she also mentioned, was higher and further education, and I listened to what the Cabinet Secretary said in relation to those in her speech.
As you draw
to conclude, Presiding Officer, the committee is in agreement that this bill is required to improve the situation of those attempting to access public sector contracts. It is content that the bill establishes a national procurement framework for Scotland that will improve consistency and transparency. Therefore, on behalf of the committee, I recommend that the general principles of the bill be agreed to.
Thanks. Tight for time today. Now calling James Kelly. Up to 10 minutes, please, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to open this afternoon's debate on behalf of the Labour Party, and also to indicate that we will be supporting the general principles of the bill at 5 o'clock. As others before me have said, I want to echo the comments in recognition of the work carried out by the committee, the convener Maureen Watt, the other committee members and the clerks in terms of the scrutiny of the bill and the report that they have produced. There is no doubt that this legislation, with £10 billion of public sector spend in procurement, this is a key part of legislation. And there's an opportunity here not only to have an impact on economic growth, but also to send a key signal in terms of how we operate within Scotland in relation to the fairness agenda. And there could be no clearer example of that than the living wage. At a time when, in the past 43 months, inflation has risen more than wages, that has hit the low-paid hardest. It's hit call centre staff, cleaners and labourers. And there's no doubt that if the bill were able to ensure that these contracts had a commitment in it to the living wage, that on a yearly basis that would... Just let me develop this point, that on a yearly basis that would mean 2,200 additional monies to those who are currently paid the minimum wage. I'll give way to Kevin Stewart.
Kevin Stewart.
Mr Kelly for giving way, and I don't think anyone in this chamber wouldn't agree that the living wage would be a good thing to include. But Mr Kelly will be aware of the Ruffert versus Niedersachsen case, and I wonder if he'd like to comment on that. And beyond that, does he not think it would be best that if this Parliament had control over the minimum wage so that we could deal with matters appropriately?
James Kelly.
I'll come to the legal position in just a minute. I will address that point. I mean, it's no accident that the calls for the living wage are widely endorsed in submissions to the bill by the Enough Food for Everyone campaign, the SCVO, the STUC and Stop Climate Chaos. There's no doubt that many throughout Scotland see this bill as an opportunity. And I agree with Nicola Sturgeon that the living wage is an issue that Labour and the SNP agree on, and we should be working together to ensure that the provisions within the bill are stringent to deliver the living wage. In terms of the legal advice, there is alternative legal advice available, which Unison have provided. And I think the issue for the government, they need to look beyond the legal advice that they've got. I think it's about how you ask the question to the European Union, and also linking the issue to the performance of the contracts. So I think the government have to. The government have to let me make this point. The government have to engage more on this issue than simply standing behind the legal advice that they've got just now. Mr Stewart.
I thank Mr Kelly for giving way again. You can get legal advice, and you can get different legal advice from the same lawyer, has been my experience in life. But Rufert versus Niedersachsen is actually case law, rather than just legal advice. Would it not be best if we were at the top table in Europe to try and change this situation?
Kelly.
The point I'd make to you, Mr Stewart, it's about how you construct your legislation. As I said, if you link the issue to performance, then there is a way forward here. And what the government need to do is interact with the alternative legal opinions that are available, and with those that want this bill to achieve the delivery of a living wage than simply repeating the case law of only one case. I think this would send out a powerful signal if this Parliament was to ensure that the £10 billion of public sector spend that's covered by this legislation ensured that the living wage was paid. That would be welcomed by workers and communities across Scotland, and I ask the Government to examine the issue again. On the issue of community benefit, I think that is to be welcomed within the bill. Again, with so much money being allocated, there is an opportunity for companies to work closely with communities to achieve, as the Jimmy Reid Foundation said, looking at the wider social and economic benefits that this spend can be achieved. And indeed, in the submission from CITB, they gave the very practical example of including provisions around apprentices and training, which not only can benefit the delivery of the contracts, but can make a real difference to local economies. I think the FSB made some really strong points in their submission about the small business impact. I think the fact that for every pound of spend, there can be 63 pence additional impact in communities for spend from small companies, compared with 40 pence for large companies, is something that is well worthy of taking on board. And I think the point that Malcolm Chisholm made about the size of the contracts and looking at to try and debundle the contracts is something that we should examine closely, because there's no doubt that what we need to do is to try and ensure that this £10 billion of spend is spread throughout Scotland, so that it's not concentrated on one or two areas of key economic impact. To get the most of it, it's got to move throughout the country. On the issue of fair trade, I campaigned and supported for Scotland to get fair trade nation status, along with SNP politicians like the co-convener of the cross-party group in fair trade, George Adam, and that's something that I welcomed. But I think that the Scottish Fair Trade Forum makes a very fair point when it says that it's not enough in terms of this legislation to ask companies to consider fair trade issues. And I think there's got to be a more serious commitment in the legislation. There's got to be an explicit recognition of that fair trade status if we're going to make the most of it. And again, I think that's an issue that Labour will certainly return to at stage 2. On the important issue of tax avoidance, I think it's right when we've got influence on so many contracts that it's right to expect fair and ethical business practices. I think as SCIAF acknowledged in their submission, aggressive tax avoidance is something that we are not comfortable with. I mean, that is taking money out of the public purse. And I think the bill has got to be looking closely at scrutiny of company taxation policies so that we can ensure that there are ethical business practices in place. I think as the bill stands, as I said, we are supporting the general principles, but as the bill stands, there are a couple of problems with it. I think the government looks to be laying too great an emphasis on the guidelines. As I said earlier in relation to the living wage, and as Neil Findlay pointed out on blacklisting, it's all very well to give warm words and make all the right statements, but the point of legislation should be to make a difference. And the worry would be that by putting so much emphasis on the guidelines, then the legislation will not achieve the objectives that the government and the Labour opposition want it to achieve. I think another problem is around the exemptions. As Tavi Scott correctly pointed out, the Scottish Futures Trust and the hubcos that operate under the Scottish Futures Trust are exempt, and that seems a peculiar decision to me, again, given the millions of pounds that flow through those hubcos in terms of contracts. It would seem absolutely logical and correct that those hubcos should be covered by this legislation if we're really serious about the legislation making a difference. In summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, we will be supporting the general principles at 5 o'clock, but I think that if the government have to translate their words in Nicola Sturgeon's speech into real action on issues like the living wage, then we need to see some real commitments coming forward at stage 2. The Labour Party will be submitting a raft of amendments on a number of issues in order to strengthen the bill, and we look forward to engaging with the bill during the stage 2 process.
Many thanks. Now call on Alex Johnston. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Johnston.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Procurement is an important part of what government and government agencies do, and it is an active and developing field. In fact, we've already come a long way since the days in which a construction contract in the Western Isles was issued on the basis of the cheapest bidder, only for the job to be done by a company from outside Scotland employing no local labour, and when they left, having completed that contract, they left with local firms unpaid and debts that were never actually dealt with. The truth is that we do need to consider procurement quite seriously, but the Scottish model of procurement, which has gone before this, is something which is a good foundation on which to base our progress. In fact, if we look at the bill that's come before us, it is, I would say, wholesome, it's modest, it's functional, and it has plenty of good intentions within it. Sometimes, of course, governments are inclined to take a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Other times, governments will herald a bill by suggesting it's going to be a pantechnicon complete with bells and whistles, and what comes along is pure, it is simple, and it is functional. I prefer that approach, and I'm delighted that's the nature of the bill that we have in front of us. I think the Minister in her opening remarks actually acknowledged that that's what has happened, and she will receive no complaints from me for taking that approach. Yet, I'm giving away no secrets when I suggest that we will be happy to vote for this at stage 1 tonight. However, there are some concerns, and my concerns revolve around things that are not in the bill, and perhaps some things that I would not like to see in the bill. However, I will start with some of the improvements I would like to see. And we've already had a number of quotes from the Federation of Small Businesses, but I wondered if I could take the opportunity to quote slightly more extensively. The FSB's submission to members before this debate suggests that the scope of the bill needs to be extended to include hubcos and ALEOs to ensure that organisations purchasing on behalf of the public sector adhere to the same standards that we would expect of public sector purchasers, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable request to make. They also suggest that while they agree with the low-value, below-threshold contracts of under 50,000 should not have the same conditions attached to them as high-value contracts, commitments to improve procurement should apply to all public sector purchasing. For example, the duty to behave in a proportionate and transparent manner is a reasonable expectation, and I am supportive of these principles. However, in ensuring that our procurement system is fair to all, it's important that we don't over-egg the situation. It must be fair to all. And I have heard some individuals suggest that we could have a procurement system in place which went out of its way to favour, for example, third sector organisations or supported businesses or social enterprises. I think we do need a fair system, one that is fair across the board. Although I have to say I was amazed to discover that these types of businesses which concern us here were actually disadvantaged in the previous system. So I think there's a great deal to be had for them when we take this forward. Also, the issue of community benefit clauses, I believe, can be very valuable if handled in the right way. And I will look very closely at how they emerge at the third stage of this bill. There are, however, some very interesting questions that still need to be answered, and that is why this bill doesn't cover Scottish Water. I'm not saying it should, I'm simply saying there's a huge inconsistency there in that a large, apparently public sector organisation appears to be exempted from the terms of the bill. Some would say it should be included. Some within this chamber might say there's another solution, and that would be to remove them from the public sector, but let's not go there today. The issue of thresholds is one that was discussed at some length during the course of the Stage 1 inquiry, and it has to be said that most of the witnesses believed that the thresholds had been placed in the roughly the right position. However, some of them were unable to tell us why they thought that was the case. However, the threshold issue is one which did not seem to stimulate the amount of argument it might have done. We've heard during the course of this debate so far mention of issues relating to blacklisting, wage levels and zero-hour contracts. I think it's important that we do take into account the fact that there are concerns about these issues, but I do believe that this is not perhaps the appropriate place for some of these issues to be covered. We've also heard issues of tax behaviour. I would emphasise that there is a significant difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. I'll get to that in a minute after I take an intervention.
Members in his last minute, not taking an intervention.
My apologies. In coming to a conclusion, I do have to say that it is appropriate, in my view, that wage levels are not included in this. I think it's more important that we deal with the wages issue through the normal channels. It's important that we do not have one wage structure for public sector contracts and another for the rest of the economy. For that reason, I am prepared to debate the issues of wage structures either in this place or in any other forum and take the opportunity to ensure that we have a standardised approach to that. When it comes to tax, just to finalise my remarks on that, it is important that we understand the difference between avoidance and evasion, and those who evade tax are criminals and should be prosecuted in that way. In closing, I will say that fairness and transparency are essential in this bill, that value for money for the taxpayer is also a sound objective, and that I share the objectives that appear to be those of the government. So let's move forward and get this prepared.
Now call on Kevin Stewart to be followed by Mary Fee. We're very tight for time, up to 6 minutes, including interventions. Please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I rise to support the bill at Stage 1. I've told the Chamber before that I'm a little bit of a procurement anorak, and I've said in previous speeches that legislation cannot be seen as being the panacea, as the Cabinet Secretary has said today. And what is often required is some common sense and gumption. And instead of rigidity and being risk-averse, I think it is time for folk to put some common sense into practice. However, in saying that, I do think that the bill itself will help in a lot of regards. Now, like many MSPs, I meet businesses very, very regularly indeed, and quite often procurement comes up. I met recently with a coffee and beverage supplier in my constituency, with a vending machine supplier, and beyond that, I met with an Aberdeen builder on Monday, and I said that we were going through the process of this Stage 1 today, and I says I'm willing to take on board any comments that you have. I have rather a large email from Mr Kenny Anderson of Anderson Construction. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to touch upon all aspects of that, but I think some of the things that he has pointed out, which I'm going to go over, shows where common sense is actually required. Mr Anderson points out in the email, Construction Line is a self-funded organisation paid for by contractors and consultants via subscription, membership of which is prerequisite of many public authorities. They hold verified financial health, safety, welfare, insurance, environmental and capability information in all members and is designed to prevent the need for public authorities to carry out endless bureaucratic checks on all of these things during the qualification tender applications. Mr Anderson says that despite all of this, a number of public bodies, local authorities, continue to put in place bureaucratic onerous processes which are already covered by the Construction Line agreement. That seems to me to be completely and utterly illogical. And it is this kind of duplication of effort that really gets on the wick of small and medium enterprise business owners. And I think, again, that's something that we can't legislate for, but something that we have got to get right in the system, either through the guidance or actually by ensuring that gumption is put in place and that best practice is exported throughout. Ms Watt, I'll give
Watt.
Member for giving way. Does he agree with me that if more local authorities and other public bodies use the portal for this, where the PQQ is standardised, a lot of companies could avoid that situation?
Kevin Stewart.
I agree with Ms Watt. I think that uniformity is the key, and that consistency that can be provided through the national procurement framework, I think, is what is required to get that consistency right across the board. Mr Anderson goes on and talks about quality weighting scores, which is another thing that many business owners talk about all of the time, because sometimes they're not explained to them properly and they don't understand. Mr Anderson says the quality weighting scores in some tender submissions is so subjective it can wildly distort the cost of executing some projects and discriminates against SMEs perfectly capable of doing the work. And I think that we have got to get that situation much, much better than it currently is. Presiding Officer, I could go on with other comments which I will submit from Mr Anderson at a later stage, but I think I better move on, because one of the other things which came out in evidence at my committee was, of course, round about health and social care contracts, and I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary touched upon that in her opening remarks. The Coalition of Care and Support Providers have said evidence has shown that procurement processes for care and support services, and in particular competitive tendering, have tended to be driven primarily by cost, with major risks for the quality, continuity and stability of service provision for workforce planning, development, pay, terms and conditions, and for the well-being of service users and their families. And again, I think that some of that is the rigidity round about the weighting at the PQQ stage. And I do think that local authorities in particular should be looking at the best practice that is happening in various parts of the country round about this particular area, because best value, Presiding Officer, is not always about cost. And, you know, as my old granny used to say, buy cheap, you buy dear, because you're going to have to go through the process of procuring again and again and again if something doesn't work. And I do think, again, that most of this is round about gumption rather than by legislation. But I do think that the guidance can provide some help in that regard. Presiding Officer, I could go on at great length. I'm running out of time. I would urge the Parliament to support Stage 1 today. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Mary Fee to be followed by Linda Fabiani. Up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We on the Labour benches are committed to highlighting the positive benefits that procurement reform can bring, and we are supportive of the general principles of the bill. However, there is still a lot of work to do by the Government for the bill to achieve its objectives of reform. And on these benches, we have reservations that the changes that are required won't be implemented on areas such as community benefit clauses, the living wage and on blacklisting. We welcome the community benefit clauses for significant contracts. However, there were concerns raised through the committee evidence sessions that the £4 million threshold is far too high, and I have to agree on that. And the committee have called on the Scottish Government to provide information on how the community benefit requirement can be encouraged in contracts of less than £4 million, and I wait to find out how this can be worked, or indeed if the threshold can be lowered. And Section 20 shows that the threshold can be changed by order. But under what circumstances will this be made? Will there be any period for evaluation before this takes place? And again, these are questions that need to be answered at stage 2, if not stage 3. James Kelly rightly pointed out the need for a living wage in procurement, and taking people out of in-work poverty can be achieved through procurement, and this bill is a missed opportunity for an introduction of a living wage. Advice from trade unions and legal professionals show that we can put in place legislation that will enforce a living wage. And as we often hear in this chamber, that Civic Scotland needs to be listened to. So when Enough Food for Everyone, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, the Scottish Trade Unions Congress and Stop Climate Chaos say that the living wage is a priority, I hope their calls don't fall on deaf ears. And as we often heard through the evidence sessions, this is an enabling piece of legislation, so let's enable people to get the living wage through this piece of legislation. And on the issue of blacklisting, I'm concerned that guidance doesn't go far enough. Guidance can easily be ignored. And if it is, what action can be taken against anyone found guilty of this shameful and immoral practice? The exclusion of bidders believed to have taken part in blacklisting workers is reasonable and welcoming. But what I do find odd is the acceptance of a firm for a contract as long as they take remedial action. And what would this remedial action be? Workers are still fighting for apologies and quite rightly compensation. So is this the action we expect from any company wishing to take on a public contract? Section 10 of the bill looks at supported businesses and how we can include them more in the awarding of contracts. We would like to see more information on how supported businesses are engaged with and supported using the framework. The evidence from the STUC suggests that every public authority have at least one contract with a supported business. And I imagine it would be hard for anyone to argue against that, given the evidence by Duncan Skinner of Glencraft at committee, who gave what can be viewed as a stark warning that supported businesses such as Glencraft fall below the parameters of this bill. Many supported businesses won't have the resources to compete for contracts of over £50,000. However, I hope that opening certain contracts to supported businesses only goes a long way to support the businesses and, of course, the employees, especially after the disgraceful handling of their employee business across Scotland. The sustainable procurement duty can be enhanced by making it more person-centred to improve the well-being of those that use the services tendered. This point has clearly been made by CCPS, and I look to stage 2 of the bill to improve this duty. And all too often the thoughts and wishes of service users are rarely taken into consideration, and the Procurement Reform Bill can correct this. The RSPB have called for sustainable procurement to be clearly defined in Section 9 and for the Scottish Government to clarify the overall aim of the bill in socio-economic and environmental outcomes. For procurement to be sustainable, we need to facilitate the involvement of small and medium enterprises, supported businesses and the third sector. The committee heard the definition of SMEs needs to be addressed to incorporate micro-businesses, as workplaces with greater levels of staff appear to perform better in procurement than those businesses with only a handful of staff. And the Federation of Small Businesses suggested in evidence that annual reports contain a breakdown of micro, small, medium and large businesses, Rightly so, as we need to ensure that as many types of companies can play a role in public contracts, and we await the Government's response in advance to Stage 2.
Final minute.
When committee members visited the Tayside Procurement Consortium in December, I was impressed to hear how authorities work with businesses to ensure that public money stays within local areas where possible. Replicating this type of consortium could be crucial for improving communities across Scotland. And finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Fair Trade Forum has welcomed the principles of the bill, but would like to see an increased uptake of fair trade in public procurement. To achieve this, there must be greater reporting of how fair trade organisations can get involved. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Linda Fabiani to be followed by Neil Finlay.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I haven't been involved in any of the committees or anything that has been looking at this issue, but it does seem to a backbencher here that's been going on for some time. We seem to have been talking about making procurement better for a long, long time. However, when I see the work that has in fact been done by the Infrastructure Committee in particular, this is a very, very complicated piece of work. And I think there's still a long way to go, because there's an awful lot of embedded practices that need to be routed out here. And Kevin Stewart referred to quite a lot of those. But in reading through the report, there was a quote from the Federation of Small Businesses in there that I thought summed it up. They were talking about small businesses in particular, but beyond that, what it said is, this is an important step in changing how we view procurement in Scotland, recognising that public spending decisions can affect a number of other policy objectives, and expecting our public bodies to consider this in a more strategic fashion. And I think that's what's at the very, very heart of what the Government, and I believe everyone in here, is trying to do. It's at looking at the whole picture instead of just looking at bits in isolation. It's about seeing how it all works together for betterment. And perhaps that is actually what sustainability means. It's about betterment. And when you look at the intentions of the bill, it's using the procurement process and to improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of a local authority's area, facilitating the involvement of small and medium enterprises. And yes, like Mary Fee, I hope that micro enterprises will be included in that. I think that's very important. Third sector bodies supported businesses. Promoting innovation. That's hugely important. I represent East Kilbride, in case anybody doesn't know that, which is Scotland's first and most successful new town, I have to say. And the worth of that new town and its value at the start and what it achieved was about innovation and people working together for that improvement. So it can be done. It was being done decades ago. It can be done again. I think we've lost some of that innovative spirit that allows us to work together to do these things. So hugely important. However, not always easy. I think the last time I spoke in procurement, I mentioned the report from the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland. I should declare my honorary fellowship of that organisation. And there was a President's Commission specifically on procurement carried out a couple of years ago, because there was real concerns, particularly in the construction industry at that time, about how procurement was operated in terms of through EU regulations, but also back to what Kevin Stewart said about the lack of a level playing field for so many, because our public bodies did not have any uniformity in how they approached these things. My own view is that some of that is about a culture we have created, which is about people being terrified to be innovative, being frightened to take risks, because they're always worried they get the blame for something. So there's so many folk all over our public bodies who are terrified that they're going to end up getting lambasted for something, and who therefore cover their backs to a degree, a wee minute, and I certainly will, to a degree that means that they are therefore frightened to do some of the things that would in fact benefit our communities as a whole.
Neil Finlay.
Does the member agree that maybe the Scottish Government should take a risk and go forward and implement the living wage through procurement and take the risk of a challenge?
Linda Fabiani.
What I would say to you, Mr Finlay, is after years of experience in here, whenever our government tries to take a risk, you're the first in your feet to have a go at them. So I think it's a bit rich for you to be sitting there saying that, I have to say.
Through the chair, please.
But I'm terribly sorry, Presiding Officer. But what I would say in relation to that is, yes, we all want to be innovative and take risks, and that happens to government as well. Please. However, there are rules which must be followed, and I am absolutely confident that the Cabinet Secretary and the rest of our government are committed to doing what they can to ensure everyone in Scotland a decent living wage, and that absolutely everything will be done to try and achieve that through this bill, if not straight into primary legislation. And I also believe the same applies to the fair trade element of it too. Now, we've been looking at this for years.
Final minute.
Through the EU. There are issues there, of course there are, but we all want it. My personal belief, Scotland will not be a fair trade nation, truly, until we are able to say that we can procure fairly. And that applies at home as well as it does to overseas. But there are issues there. The nation-states in the European Union, the UK, been asking them for years to try and look at this, because other nation-states have. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can enlighten me sometime in the future whether, in fact, the UK Government has carried up that challenge in taking it straight to the EU. So, yes, I want things to be better. Yes, I want outcomes to be better for everyone. But the key to it is simplification and innovation. And the key to it is people working together, trying to get things like the living wage, trying to do procurement. It's not about looking to say where you can kick the government. The first one in this country has really tried to do something about this.
Thank you very much. I call Neil Findlay to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and can I declare my interest as a member of Unite the Union. This bill, on the face of it, seems like a dry, somewhat humdrum piece of legislation, but such an analysis, I believe, would be completely and utterly wrong. The bill has the potential, using the current powers this place has, to transform the lives of thousands of Scots and their families. And it's not constitutional change that will achieve that. It's good old-fashioned political will and guts that could do that. In short, Presiding Officer, what the Scottish Government put in this bill will be a measure of their willingness to work for substantial and important political and economic change, whatever the constitutional settlement. And this bill will test the progressive claims of the Scottish Government. Let's see if the progressive beacon rhetoric has turned into reality, or as a faint and rather dull flicker. Presiding Officer, the public sector in Scotland has an awful lot of money to spend. We could use that spending power much better, more progressively, to ensure that taxpayers' money is spent in a more ethical and fairer way, with better social and economic outcomes for our society and people.
Please.
But, Presiding Officer, I want to focus on three specific areas. Firstly, on blacklisting. This is now a well-documented human rights abuse where men and women have been victimised and had their careers and livelihoods taken from them for having the temerity to join a trade union, be a trade union organiser, a safety rep, or political or environmental activist. And who was involved in this organised conspiracy to destroy lives? Some of our biggest construction companies, household names like McAlpines, Balfour Beatty, Kia, Skanska, Amey and many others, including the Forth Bridge Constructors joint venture. All companies who are today working in public contracts across Scotland, taking our money, and yet still to apologise to the 400 Scottish workers affected, still to admit that what they did, and still to pay a penny in compensation. A human rights abuse on a grand scale, significantly financed by the taxpayer. And we need to send a message out to the construction industry that the game is up on blacklisting. The Government has moved on this issue, and I commend them for that. And that's been through the campaigning of people inside this Parliament, but also pressure from UCAT, the GMB, Unite and others working with us. There is a commitment to introduce guidance, but I don't think this is nearly enough. We need a clause on blacklisting written into the bill. Otherwise, the sharks in the industry will find a way round it and ignore it.
Jim Eadie.
I'm grateful to Mr Findlay for taking an intervention.
Mr Eadie, could you address your microphone if in fact it's on?
It is actually on. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to Mr Finlay for taking an intervention, and I pay tribute to him for leading the campaign on blacklisting. But does he realise that in the Stage 1 consideration of the bill, in response to a question from my colleague Mary Fee, the Cabinet Secretary said, "We are taking enabling powers. That is in addition to the guidance that the First Minister launched a couple of weeks ago. There will be legislation. It's secondary legislation."
Neil Finlay.
I appreciate Mr Eady's intervention, and I hope that the Cabinet Secretary, in winding up, will maybe elaborate on that and what that actually means practically on the ground, and that would be very welcome if she did. I think there is much more we can do on that subject, and I look forward to what the Cabinet Secretary will say in winding up. Another clause that I believe has to be introduced is in the area of taxation. I notice the bill suggests there must be an obligation to pay tax. But what does that actually mean? Does it mean firms involved in tax avoidance and evasion are excluded from public contracts? I hope so. After all, why should companies who have avoided or evaded paying the very tax that supports our public services be allowed to take money from the public purse but not contribute to it? Why should companies that benefit from our education system, roads network, communication systems be allowed to get off with paying their fair share? Why should big business, with clever accountants, get away with what small businesses can't?
Mr Finlay for giving way, Presiding Officer. And Mr Johnson earlier on pointed out there is a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Wouldn't it be better if the Parliament here had the powers over tax so that we could make some of those avoidance schemes illegal?
Neil Finlay.
Here is an example of this Parliament having the powers now and ability to do something now. Are we going to take that opportunity or are we not? That is the question. And maybe Mr Stewart can learn from his SNP colleagues at Westminster, Mike Weir and Angus Robertson, who both signed an early day motion calling on the Westminster Government to, and I quote, "bring forward a set of legally binding procurement rules that subject companies delivering and bidding for the delivery of public service contracts to high ethical, environmental and anti-tax avoidance standards." Can the Scottish Government confirm whether they agree with their Westminster colleagues, and will they ensure that a similar clause is introduced into the bill here today? Finally, Presiding Officer, I welcome the commitment to bring in an amendment to exempt health and care contracts from the requirement to advertise and compete. This is a very important step, especially in light of the scandal that is social care in Scotland at the moment, and I challenge the Government also to use the bill to end poverty pay. Presiding Officer, I'll leave it at that. I know time is running tight, but I would appreciate the Cabinet Secretary addressing some of these issues. Summing up.
Many thanks. Jim Eadie to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am delighted to have the opportunity to contribute to this afternoon's debate as a member of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, which has taken evidence on the bill and, of course, is responsible for scrutinising the legislation. As Maureen Watts said in her speech on behalf of the committee, there are a number of areas where the committee seeks clarification and assurances from the Government on behalf of the stakeholders who gave evidence during Stage 1, and there will doubtless be further areas subject to both Government and backbench amendments at Stage 2 as we seek to strengthen further the provisions of the bill. But as the Cabinet Secretary made clear, the bill should not be seen in isolation. It is part of a range of measures and government-led initiatives to improve public procurement and should be seen in the context of a process of public sector reform which began under a previous administration with the publication of the John McClelland report in 2006. And organisations across a range of sectors have indicated their support for the principles of the bill. As Linda Fabiani said, the Scottish Federation of Small Businesses Scotland have welcomed the bill as being unlikely to solve all small business difficulties with procurement, but it could be an important step in changing how we view procurement in Scotland. The Scottish Building Federation stated the bill is an important contribution towards the objective of reducing the administrative and financial burden on industry of participating in public sector procurement and delivering public procurement outcomes that are more sustainable. and the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland stated the bill contains a number of important provisions that are likely to result in significant improvements to procurement practice. Now, there are areas where the Government have already provided assurances in relation to strengthening the provisions of the bill. One of these is in relation to a constituency interest of mine, the University of Edinburgh. There was initially some concern expressed by the organisations representing universities and colleges that the bill could damage the sector's activities around research excellence. But I am glad that the Government has listened to and acted upon those concerns, and the Cabinet Secretary gave a commitment that it is our intention to exempt contracts that are in pursuit of commercial activities, which would include research and development, from the requirement to advertise under the bill. I very much welcome that commitment. Further areas include, of course, the issue that has already been discussed this afternoon, that of blacklisting. An unacceptable and illegal practice, and I repeat again my tribute to Neil Findlay for the way in which he has assiduously taken forward this issue both within and out with the Chamber. This has no place in modern employment practice, and I am glad that the Government has made significant progress. The Cabinet Secretary made clear in evidence to the committee that this matter would be dealt with through secondary legislation that is given anchorage in primary legislation through the bill. When asked by me if the Government had gone as far as it is possible to go, the Cabinet Secretary stated, "The ongoing dialogue with the trade unions is important. We need to continue to talk to them to make it absolutely clear that anything that we can do to banish blacklisting will be done." It was a hero of Mr Findlay's, Vladimir Ilyich, who once asked the question, what is to be done? Well, the Cabinet Secretary has made it clear that blacklisting will be banished. She went on to emphasise that the bill and the regulations will make it possible to exclude a company from public contracts where there is evidence that it has been engaged in blacklisting and has not taken appropriate remedial action to put its house in order. Presiding, of course.
Neil Findlay.
I genuinely am asking this. What does that mean, that there will be secondary legislation? What is the impact of that? What does that actually mean?
Jimmy T.
Well, I don't think it's possible for the Cabinet Secretary to be any clearer. It will mean that blacklisting is illegal and that any company that fails to take remedial action will be forced to put its house in order. Now, if that... Well, you've got... I will take an intervention, but you've had guidance, you've had legislation. I don't see what more is possible for government to do.
Neil Findlay.
Is it not just easier to put it in the bill?
Jimmy T.
Well, the enabling provisions of the bill are such that it will be possible to outlaw blacklisting. But I'm absolutely certain that if that was not the case and further action was required, then the government would take further action. I have absolute confidence that we are doing all that we can, and obviously the Cabinet Secretary will elaborate further on that in her summing up. So the Cabinet Secretary has provided a commitment to bring forward an amendment at stage 2, as other members have said, to exempt health and care contracts from the requirement to advertise and compete. This was something that was called for by the committee at paragraph 184 of its Stage 1 report. Now, that's important because at present many authorities consider themselves to be under a strict legal obligation to put contracts and frameworks out to tender routinely, including existing contracts on expiry, regardless of service user views and whether there are any performance issues pertaining. And this can lead to major disruption and discontinuity in the provision of services, as well as pressure on workforce pay terms and conditions. So I very much welcome that commitment as well. Other members have referred to fair trade. I look forward to continuing dialogue with the Government on the issues of both human rights and fair trade, and I hope that further progress can be made during the passage of the bill. The overriding challenge for Scotland, and ultimately the test of whether this bill is successful, is whether we can, as James Kelly suggested, drive economic and employment opportunities across the supply chain and across Scotland. I am confident that we can do that, and I look forward to further improvements to the legislation.
Thank you. I must remind members that its speech is 6 minutes, and I may have to reduce that time later on in the debate. Tavish Scott to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to endorse the principles of the bill that the Deputy First Minister outlined in her opening remarks. But I want to, with one qualification, and that is the one that James Kelly picked up from my earlier intervention, and that is the use of the Scottish Futures Trust and the hubcos that now exist across Scotland. They spend hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money building essential public buildings, one of which is currently, or soon to be, I hope, under construction in my own constituency. And that is very welcome indeed. But I do believe that it's very important that this structure, this body, which after all is a creation of government, and has been created by the current government, is compelled to comply with exactly the same principles and guidance that has been very fairly outlined by many members, including the committee convener across the chamber this afternoon. It seems to me entirely appropriate that when vast amounts of public money are spent, and we are describing the £9 to £10 billion that is spent by government at all levels across Scotland on an annual basis, that spend should be governed by a set of principles that have been fairly outlined by the Deputy First Ministers. It should apply to every part of that. Now, the Federation of Small Business said just the other day that they are concerned about the hubco model in this context. These are, they say, new institutions spending significant sums of taxpayers' money who are signing up for contracts which will last for a generation or more, but whose remit isn't widely understood and who don't seem accountable to anyone in particular. And I would share that concern. When I ask about the North Hubco in relation to the building of the new Anderson High School in Lerwick, about how much money they are earning from that contract, what the contract actually looks like, what maintenance payments will be paid to Miller for the next 25 years, because that is the nature of that contract. And is that similar to the other 5 schools that have been built in the northeast of Scotland by the Hubco? I fail to get an answer. I'm not absolutely sure who is responsible, who is accountable, and therefore the very fair test that the Deputy First Minister set out of transparency surely is currently not met, and surely should be met by this bill in relation to Scottish Futures Trust spending and the Hubcos in particular. I'd also like to highlight the concerns, or just as Kevin Stewart did, of a business in his own constituency, of the Shetland Architectural Society, representing a range of different architects in Shetland. They have written on this subject recently and say it is our understanding that the end result of the Hubco model for local architects, engineers and quantity surveyors is that small firms, less than 10 staff, which make up the majority of firms in Scotland, will not be able to tender for the work. In other words, these businesses, will be squeezed out by several larger firms who can compete at that level. I think those are legitimate concerns for, after all, the great majority of businesses that make up the Scottish economy, and they at the moment have those profound worries about this model. And my question for the Deputy First Minister is whether this bill can accommodate those concerns by including the Scottish Futures Trust and the Hubco model in the bill. And I believe that's what the government should seek to do. I give her one further example, not in fairness about the Hubcos, but about procurement more generally. And that is a very small one, but it seems to me to epitomise and to make the argument that many small businesses are making. The bill is strong in its support for the small business sector. But this is the challenge that exists, and this is over the purchasing of books. Why is it not appropriate to apply exactly the same process to a small transaction whose nature means that it is counterproductive in terms of price? In the case of book supply for Scottish libraries, the procurement process for one book in terms of administration is the same as that of a bulk order. It is little wonder that the Scottish Government book supply for contracts worth in total over £50 million per annum has reduced the number of Scottish-owned suppliers to 3 small businesses. 2 of them are now almost certainly marginal in terms of supply volumes. And I hope those are the kind of issues that will be addressed by this bill and by the procurement system. The other area that I would ask the Deputy First Minister to clarify in terms of the scope of the bill is that of Scottish Excel, which is very much a one-size-fits-all procurement system.
Final minute.
in particular in terms of the procurement of food for our schools, provides some concerns, because the sourcing, for example, of frozen food for 28 out of our 32 local authorities is organised through one company, Breaks, who actually, as I understand it, are based in the home counties of England. So there appear to me to be the basic point is that just as the Scottish Futures Trust and the HubCo model should be included in the scope of this bill, so should Scottish Excel, so as to ensure the very principles that the Deputy First Minister rightly set out in the beginning of this debate are included and cover these organisations, given the enormous spend they have on the face of Scotland today.
Many thanks. I call Chick Brodie to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, may I say I'm delighted to participate in this debate today as someone who, over some years, has bought things from widgets to recruitment services to UK government large product procurement, and also to have been part of a very constructive and successful visit to Brussels last year, led by my colleague Maureen Watt, and to the explanations and clarity from Scotland Europa on the proposed EU procurement directives and their transposition to Scottish law. Presiding Officer, the overriding objectives, and I think we all agree this in this chamber, of the proposed reforms have to be openness and transparency, simplicity, to be competitive, efficient, cost-effective, and to ensure the absolute minimum of bureaucracy. And the bill goes, I believe, a long way to in fact do that. But I make no apologies that my prime emphasis today is on SMEs, social enterprise and the third sector involvement in the public procurement landscape. One of the key attributes to this was in the evidence given by Karen Bowman to Edinburgh University. She pointed out in evidence to the committee that the bill, she believes, has missed the opportunity to place an obligation on public bodies to ensure that their procurement people are trained and trained effectively. And I would hope that we would discuss that and encourage that as the whole process goes forward. Also in that context, it is important that a meaningful, accredited contract organisations or organisations be engaged or constructed to support micro-businesses, SMEs and social enterprises. This might be done in partnership, for example, with organisations like the FSB or Social Enterprise Scotland or the many others, as these two being just two examples. Presiding Officer, I know from personal experience the investment made in the training of excellent contracts managers pays back in spades. The other consideration has to be the simplification of contracts and the securing as best we can of templates which reduce the fear of breaching European Parliament directives, particularly by those businesses and the size of businesses that I've mentioned. And that said, Presiding Officer, I express some concern at the suggestion, the possibility of contracts being drawn into smaller lots. While the intent of this objective is laudable, the practicalities in terms of efficiency, costs and the administration must be a consideration. The unbundling of such contracts will require a greater degree of management and management control, which interfaces and communicates could be fraught in these connections with cost and legal implications. And I do adhere to the committee's suggestion that the government provide clarification on the implementation of the appropriate European directives in this case. Presiding Officer, the purpose of the bill is to develop the framework that we talked about, that procurement framework that will deliver all of the things that I mentioned at the beginning, but also social and environmental benefits, to encourage innovation, to, again, I repeat, secure transparency, standardisation, fairness and business friendliness. To put that 9 billion or 10 billion of plus of procurement, it is right that we establish and secure procurement strategies which form part of a public sector or local authority development plan. And while I understand the request and the recommendation that's made in the report for annual procurement reports, it might be that that energy be diverted into more random public audits and company compliance, finance and employee practices, rather than into seeking information and producing reports which may not, at the end of the day, achieve the readability we desire and the outcomes desired of these reports. Presiding Officer, the STUC suggested that the bill should require that every public authority should have at least one contact with a supported business. And notwithstanding the requirement at Section 8(1), our ambition, I believe, should be to contract with supported businesses where they meet the criteria of a suitably qualified, registered supported business, and where there is then a basis for competition across several of these supported businesses. To help these third sector or social enterprises fully participate, there would also be the advance notification, one would hope, and registration of smaller contracts to be awarded to sit alongside the larger contracts, which is or was a characteristic of the European Journal.
Final minute.
2 brief points, Presiding Officer. We cannot, and people have mentioned this today, we cannot legally compel suppliers to make the living wage a prerequisite or condition of the contract. And the bill, in the appropriate sections, 122 to 127, makes that very clear. But an appropriate commercial due diligence on the relationship between customer service requirements and remuneration and profitability might be a condition of contract determination. And we might very well look at this place as a start. Presiding Officer, lastly, successful procurement exists where ethics and transparency prevail. I abhor blacklisting, and I hope that Neil Findlay hears that this time, just as I reject tax evasion or non-compliance with guidance and the law.
You must close, please.
I'm just finishing. It's incumbent on all directors, managers, employees of the purchasers and the contractors to display appropriate behaviour to secure both these ethics and transparency.
Thank you. I'm afraid members will have to stick to 6 minutes, and even at that I may have to reduce it. Sarah Boyack to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is one of the most important bills I believe we will debate this session, and I do want to thank the committee and all the witnesses for all the work and contributions they've put in to date. I think this is a test of whether we get the legislation we need or whether it becomes a tick-the-box exercise. So I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to support amendments to the bill at Stage 2. There have been some valuable suggestions from a range of interested parties, such as acting on fair trade, on fresh and local food sourcing, on the living wage, on best practice in project management and also training, but also on supported employment and environmental standards. And I think this bill is about how we get the maximum social, environmental and economic value from the £9 billion of public money which is spent on goods and services. And as several colleagues have commented this afternoon, this bill has been a long time coming, so let's get it right. The Jimmy Reid Foundation correctly identified that the current system disproportionately benefits big companies and that contracts and the process currently drives down cost at the expense of quality. And that's why I was disappointed that the threshold has been set at £4 million for community benefit clauses, and there's no mechanism for debundling large contracts. If we're serious about supporting small businesses and local community businesses, it's vital that we include smaller contracts, and also that we act on the recommendations from the SCVO in terms of care. I've spoken before about what's happening in the care sector, the low-wage culture and cuts across the country that are impacting on standards and quality, and it makes it tough for the vital job of caring for the most vulnerable in our society. It makes that work unattractive, it leads to high turnover in staff, and it's not just bad news for those who are tasked with the difficult job of delivering high-quality care. It's also bad news for our older and vulnerable people who depend on skilled, committed care staff for their quality of life. So I very much welcome yesterday's launch of the Time to Care campaign by Unison, and also the submission by SCVO about health and care, which needs to be acted upon when we shape the detail of this bill at Stage 2. And that's also why the Living Wage campaign is important. As lots of other colleagues have said, blacklisting is not just unacceptable, but it also leads to a culture where staff are afraid to raise health and safety concerns. Again, that's not just about their own interests. There's a wider public interest that we need to be concerned about as well. And for me, the key test of this bill is that it should enable procurement to help deliver higher environmental standards and help in our work in tackling and mitigating climate change. It was initially going to be the Sustainable Procurement Bill, so we need to make sure that we hang on to that principle. And yesterday, the Parliament expanded the delivery of free school meals across the country. And that poses a major challenge, and I hope this bill will help us deliver to make sure that we have quality, fresh, locally sourced, fair trade school dinners and food across the country. And we need to make sure that happens right across the public sector, not just in terms of school meals. We know it can be done from the pilots that have been carried out, but it needs to be embedded in this bill so that local procurement processes make it happen. It's a huge trade and it's transformative if it's picked up in this bill. But we also need the right monitoring framework so that where we ask for environmental and community benefits, we get them delivered in practice, and it's not just promises. Finally, I want to comment on the issue of Article 19 contracts. Last week at my surgery, I met with a couple. I know them very well. They lobbied me about the issue about Remploy and the threat to Remploy. Between them, they have worked for over 50 years without pause. They have been delivering, they've been hard-working employees. And since Remploy has gone under, they have not worked. And they don't expect to get work. And their hope has been dashed by the removal of Remploy jobs in the city and the fact that we lost Blindcraft as well. And I think one of the things we must do in this bill is make sure that Section 19 contracts and supported employment companies are given a fair chance to deliver, that the staff that work for them are given a fair chance to work, to have the dignity of work, to have the capacity to support themselves so that they're not dependent on benefits, they're not caught up by the benefits system, but they actually work. They're capable to work, but they need that chance, and it's up to us to make sure that the solution is delivered in this bill. There is the Scottish Government policy of making sure that every public sector organisation has at least one supported employment contract. That is a bare minimum. We need to do better. And this bill potentially delivers on £9 billion of procurement contracts. It needs to deliver environmental, social and economic benefits, and it needs to deliver it locally. And stage 2 is where we need to make it happen. Thank you.
Many thanks. I call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Alison Johnson, but after Dennis Robertson I may have to reduce members to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I too rise in support of the principles of this bill. I was very taken by the comments that Sarah Boyack just made, and certainly I would support, I think, virtually everything that Sarah Boyack has just actually said within the chamber. And certainly with regard to Section 19, I mean, I think the bill, James Kelly said, in principle he accepts it, but it has problems. I don't accept it has problems. I actually prefer to use it has opportunities. I think the bill before us presents us all with opportunities. Opportunities to progress in the way that we feel that is what we want to do to try and achieve the objectives of having a sustainable economic growth with the environmental aspects that Sarah Boyack was talking about. I believe we can actually do that, and the challenge is how we do that. And that is the engagement. The engagement that I believe that COSLA, in their submission, said that they accept the principle of the bill before us in terms of the leaders and the senior members of COSLA. And I think it's by working together we can get this right. We're at stage 1. So stage 1 provides us with this opportunity, the opportunity to take it forward. I too, like Kevin Stewart, met with Kenny Anderson in Aberdeen earlier this week. And the construction industry has an opportunity to develop. But we need to ensure that there's an infrastructure there, that we take forward the skills and the opportunities for our younger people to come into that industry. So through the apprenticeship model that's there, we're requiring about 6,000 new people to come into the construction industry every year. So where we can look at the opportunity, we must take it. It's incumbent of us as politicians within this place to ensure that the opportunities that are there, that are taken, and we take them forward in the best possible way. I was looking at the report and a couple of questions that came to my mind, and I sincerely hope the Cabinet Secretary will be able to maybe answer them for me. It's when I was looking at the opportunities of raising the awareness for people to make applications to the public contracts. And I think this is, even when we look at the opportunities through the portal, I'm not sure that it's used in the best way that it can be. So how do we actually ensure that the opportunities are taken? And I think it is by raising the awareness. We need to ensure that when we're moving forward and the ambitions of the government and in this Parliament is actually heard in the wider community. So we've got to take that forward and ensure that the awareness is there. And I believe that the bill actually should be able to look at how we address that and how we actually ensure that we do actually achieve getting a much higher awareness of industries becoming involved within the public contract sector. I think we do miss opportunities sometimes, and I actually condemn many of the public authorities and perhaps the very large authorities sometimes for going big. We have innovative and skilled industries within Scotland. And if I look at the IT and sort of database software people within Scotland, an amazing array of opportunity, an amazing array of talent we have. But yet, local authorities and health boards tend to go for the larger companies. Now, maybe that's because they feel more secure in going for the larger companies, but I would suggest that you probably get a better deal and a much better outcome if you actually go for your maybe local enterprise unit or your local companies within an area that can actually support you. Maybe by even coming around to your office and not doing it from some distant portal somewhere else, that when you're phoning them up and saying, we can't get access, and they say, go onto the internet, and they're not listening because you're saying, we can't get access. As I say, it's opportunity, and that's what I think is at the centre of this bill. And I believe that we should be taking that forward, as I say, best we can. Presiding Officer, the area that Sarah Boyack mentioned about the supported business and social enterprise for me is extremely important. I believe that we did a disservice to our community of people with disabilities in closing Remploy. And that was at no fault of this government. That was at a fault of a Westminster government that had, for me, basically no foresight as to the impact it was having on the people and the detriment that it was going to do and the impact it was going to have on the people in taking forward their skills and their jobs and their livelihoods. Instead, what they did do was impose a regime of welfare cuts to compound the problems that they had by losing their jobs and not providing an opportunity for them to get back into constructive and dignified employment. I believe we have an opportunity to put some of these wrongs to right within this bill, and I sincerely hope the Cabinet Secretary can find a way of trying to ensure that we have a much broader definition of supported business and for our social enterprise. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call Alison Johnston to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Just over 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Procurement is not a word you'll very likely to hear in everyday conversations, and yet over the years that I've been involved in politics and green campaigning, issues around how and what the public sector buys have come up time and again. And most people, if asked, would express a desire for a common-sense approach to purchasing. Let's use public money to support local businesses and buy local goods where possible, and let's not hand taxpayers' monies to companies who don't comply with the taxation system. And at around £9 billion a year, the amount spent on public purchasing in Scotland is over 3 times the entire GDP of Malawi. So it can really potentially transform what goes on at home and overseas. And SNP members will know that the bill, as Sarah Boyack mentioned, started life as a commitment to a sustainable procurement bill in their manifesto. But 3 years on, the sustainability aspect has been reduced to a fairly timid duty. I'm concerned that the sustainability duty in Section 9 conflicts with the general duty in Section 8, which says that all bids must be treated equally and without discrimination. The aim of this bill must be to shift the procurement culture in Scotland so that, rather than talking in negative terms about discrimination, we proactively use public procurement to implement public policy aims. So we need to send an unambiguous message to procurement officers that gives them the certainty to make sustainable choices. But the balance and weighting between the duties in Sections 8 and 9 is confusing and unhelpful, and I'm very pleased that the committee has called for this to be addressed. The sustainability duty calls for consideration of impacts on the contracting authority's area, and this area is defined geographically and specifically says disregarding any areas outside Scotland. And I don't think I need to explain to members why it makes no sense to have such narrow definition in the context of national and global sustainability, and this should be amended at stage 2. I also think a further point should be added in Section 9 to include a reference to duties under the Climate Change Act. I know that all MSPs will be very proud of the many groups and institutions in their areas who have collectively helped Scotland achieve fair trade nation status. But getting fair trade to scale through public procurement has always been the holy grail for public procurement for fair trade campaigners, and it would bring huge benefits to producers in developing countries. With Fair Trade Fortnight starting on Monday, wouldn't it send a powerful message about this country if we became probably the first country in the world to put the words fair trade into a national procurement law? And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will recognise this opportunity to take the next step on our fair trade nation journey. The principle introduced by Section 31, which adds new powers to the Climate Change Act, is one of the most interesting parts of the bill. I welcome the power it creates to allow regulations that will specify proportions of recycled materials, but I question why this power shouldn't be even more ambitious and applicable across a range of sectors to stimulate the development of sustainable industries and jobs in Scotland. I strongly support the submission from Nourish Scotland calling for such an approach, with a proportion of organic food to support moves towards a lower carbon food system. And similarly, Transform Scotland has suggested publicly bought vehicle fleets could have requirements in terms of emission levels. And it's very clear that the design of guidelines, enforcement and reporting in relation to the new sustainability duty has to be right if we want to make an impact. And it makes sense to me to give a greater role to Audit Scotland to oversee procurement reporting. The regulations in Section 23, which allow a company to be excluded from a procurement process on certain grounds, is welcome. I'm very pleased to see that failure to pay tax is clearly included, but I strongly support the call from Unison and others for the wording in the bill to be strengthened to include aggressive tax avoidance. I hope we can see a wider range of criteria, so that companies with records of human rights abuses or poor safety standards can be excluded wherever in the world these abuses have occurred. I'm sure we all remember the devastating factory collapse in Bangladesh last summer. And we hear every week from ministers about their support for small businesses, yet the briefing provided by the FSB states that almost 60% of spend goes to businesses with more than 250 employees. I support the committee's call to go further in procurement reporting to separate out micro and small businesses from medium and large, so we know if we're really supporting diversity and innovation in our economy. On the living wage, Greens, like other parties, want to see this paid as widely as possible, not just to the immediate contractors, but any employees taken on via subcontracts too. I recognise the legal difficulties with respect to this, but I urge the Cabinet Secretary to be as creative and bold as possible. Presiding Officer, I very much want this bill to live up to its potential, and I'm pleased that the Government has tried to address many of the issues I mentioned. However, I feel that this bill can do more to address many of the issues raised this afternoon: community benefit, 0 hours, supported businesses and blacklisting. But let's work hard to change and improve it and make this one of the most transformative bills that we pass this session.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, to be followed by Jackie Bailey. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Representing, as I do, the biggest fishing-dependent constituency, I'm very familiar with the whole concept of sustainability. I'm also very encouraged that the provisions of the bill are likely to lead to improved opportunities for employment, particularly for young people, through the embedding of apprenticeship requirements. So there's much to be encouraging about in this bill. We've had a bit of a discussion, most recently from Alison Johnson, on the issue of sustainability. I do think Section 8 is rather confusingly constructed, because it puts sustainable procurement as an equal consideration and then says it must not trump matters such as economic operators, but then goes on to exclude the economic operators from EU procurement, but leaves the sustainable procurement in place for EU-governed procurement. So I think there is scope for the government to perhaps have a careful look at the wording of Section 8 to benefit the strength that there ought to be behind sustainable outcomes. Now, Presiding Officer, it's worth pointing to the certainty that perhaps is provided by Section 3, where regulated contracts, we have amounts that are provided for. Because one of the things that emerged in the Local Government Committee when I was on it and we were looking at regeneration was that many council officials appear to be advising their councillors and their officials further down the line in much more restrictive terms as to amounts. That they can't really just simply give business to local businesses. And I think the certainty that what's in the bill provides may certainly help on that. And I look forward to that being the case, and perhaps that being further developed as Stage 2 goes through. Now, in Section 9, the sustainable procurement duty. One of the things that is under there, which I very much welcome, is the need to promote innovation. Because I think we've got to signal absolutely clearly that we want people to be imaginative, to think a new way of doing things. It might often be something quite small that innovation involves that might have a big benefit and a big impact on a local SME, a company perhaps employing single figures of people. But when I look at Section 22 and Section 3, which is selection of tenderers, now, it may well be that the matters I'm going to raise are going to be covered in secondary legislation, and if they're not covered in the Minister's summing up, I hope they'll be taken away. And that is on the issue of novation. In other words, the general ability that there is in contract law, once you've been awarded a contract, to actually sell the contract on to someone else. Now, in general terms, contracts will say you can only sell on to other people of which we approve. But there is a general danger that if we've got a rigorous sifting process to award the contract to people that we think are decent enough to get our contract, that it can be bypassed if they then sell that contract on to others. The same applies, of course, in the engagement of subcontractors. The same issue arises. So I would certainly want to see the secondary legislation, I think, be quite clear about how these processes might happen when contracts are awarded, to make sure we do not suborn the selection of tenderers in the first place. Now, avoidance has been a subject of some discussion here. Neil Finlay used the word avoidance, and others have. James Kelly used the words aggressive tax avoidance, as did Alison Johnson, and I absolutely agree. But the trouble is, avoidance is something we actually all do every day. When I pass a filling station that's selling diesel at 1.43 to go to one that's selling at 1.33, and that is a very specific local example, I'm actually doing tax avoidance, because by buying a cheaper product, I pay less tax. And that's perfectly proper and expected. I think in many ways we should look at what the states do, where corporate taxation is based on the proportion of economic activity within the jurisdiction. If we can get our taxation on that basis, many of the problems disappear. We won't be able to do that terribly quickly, but it would be awfully nice to do it at all. The principles in the bill are not new. They are highly to be commended. I look forward to seeing this bill going through Parliament. I hope that it gives more opportunities to small local businesses and improves sustainability of the products that we buy.
Many thanks. Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Fiona MacLeod.
Presiding Officer, Officer. Today, of course, is the World Day of Social Justice. The foundation for delivering social justice, in my view, is providing a strong and inclusive economy with decent employment coupled with social protection. So that's about equality and fairness in our society and our economy. And although times are tough, this mustn't be an excuse for adopting an approach that allows finance to dominate all other considerations. We don't need a race to the bottom. We need the reverse. We need to drive up quality and we need to drive up inclusion. And this bill represents an opportunity to do just that. Others have already, more eloquently than I'm going to do, made the case for the living wage. I would simply observe that the cost of living crisis being experienced by many people in the communities we represent is not confined to those who are unemployed. There are many people who are in work and suffering from poverty. These are the people queuing at food banks, running up debt, struggling to pay their utility bills. And part of our approach must be, therefore, to make work pay, and the living wage is a powerful route to doing just that. We have witnessed the increasing casualisation of the workforce, zero-hours contracts, changes to terms and conditions, reductions in hours so that workers are now under-occupied. And the most striking impact is on women. But I have no doubt that there will be an adverse effect on those from ethnic minorities or those with disabilities too. We have an opportunity to extend the good practice of many public bodies across the country to the businesses that partner and contract with them in delivering services. After all, the services delivered are public services, so we should still expect the same ethos, the same consideration, the same approach. Can I quote Councillor Mike Holmes, who is currently the convener of Scotland Excel? And he said, "I think that procurement should be used to drive up standards, to drive up terms and conditions, to create employment and opportunities for young people. We will not give public money if you engage in poor employment practices." And so say all of us. The STUC, SCVO and others have called for the bill to ensure that there is full compliance with the public sector equality duty. I would be grateful to know from the Cabinet Secretary whether such a provision needs to be on the face of the bill or whether we can ensure that all contracts and contractors are indeed covered. Also, what about a socio-economic duty so that we can actively promote and monitor action to reduce inequality, which is an objective I'm sure we would all share. I'm also keen to see initiatives like equal pay audits being required that would consider pay gaps by gender, by ethnicity, by disability, or indeed by working pattern. The benefits are there to see for business. Improved productivity, improved performance, and they've actually enabled them as businesses to retain and attract the very best staff. Let me touch on community benefit clauses. I'm not sure that setting the starting level at £4 million is right. When I was reading the committee's report, it implied to me it was perhaps more focused on capital contracts rather than revenue. I personally believe it should be lower, but it's not the value of the contract that perhaps is the issue, but the purpose of the contract that we should focus on. Community benefit clauses have been much promoted by the Scottish Government, and Nicola Sturgeon may be surprised to hear that I totally agree with her. But in the case of the Commonwealth Games, I don't think we know how much it has improved women's chances in underrepresented industries contracting with the Games because there's no gender data being collected. And we do need to set out in guidance at the very start the need for appropriate data collection. We've seen the difficulty in getting workforce data, not just from the Commonwealth Games, but from some allios. If we don't get this right, we can't demonstrate equality of access to jobs or pursue any positive action policies to redress that imbalance. So I see the Cabinet Secretary nodding, and I hope that she will take that on board. Can I very quickly welcome the fact that health and social care services will be exempt from the provisions of the bill that relate to advertising and competition, but we need to make sure that those very organisations are funded so that they can operate the highest employment standards. Renfrewshire Council has taken the bold step of having all their social care contractors paid the living wage. It may have cost them extra money, but if we value care, we need to value the staff that provide it. Finally, Presiding Officer, If we do believe that public sector workers deserve the living wage, deserve equal pay, deserve good terms and conditions, if we believe that zero-hours contracts are wrong and blacklisting is wrong, we must not allow workers carrying out the duties of the public sector to be treated any differently. And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary is open to further improvement of the bill.
Many thanks. Fiona MacLeod, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you for finding the time. I want to concentrate all my remarks on fair trade under the sustainable duty part of the procurement bill. Now, I was, as in true librarian fashion, was going to go through section 8 point by point, but there is no time today. But if I just refer members to paragraph 53 of the committee's report, which I think summarises what I was going to talk about, and also Alison Johnson very helpfully went through a number of the points that I was going to make. In summary, and being short of time, I think it's become clear to me that if we want to make sure that sustainable procurement through this bill actually helps to promote fair trade, which many members have mentioned today in their speeches, then I think it's about guidance and it's about monitoring. Now, I asked the Cabinet Secretary questions on both those issues at the end of last year, and it kind of confirmed to me and makes me sort of more convinced about this. The committee convener talked about how important guidance is going to be in this bill. And I thought James Kelly was rather dismissive about guidance and insisting that everything has to be in the bill and that guidance, and I think also Neil Finlay, what happens when people ignore guidance. What I would say is in favour of guidance is it comes from the bill, so it has a statutory underpinning, but it allows to be more flexible. If you put something in the face of a bill, it's fixed. If you do it through guidance, you can be more flexible and adapt to the needs of different times. The committee convener also talked about monitoring and how important that's going to be in section 14 on the annual procurement reports. The committee convener was talking about how important this would be on monitoring community benefit aspects of the bill. But I think, again, this is going to be crucial in finding out if this bill does allow us to, in the sustainable duty, actually ensure that fair trade becomes part of that sustainable duty. And so the annual reports are going to be incredibly important in this. Alison Johnson talked about putting fair trade on the face of the bill, and I know that the Scottish Fair Trade Forum have talked about this. And initially, for me, that was very appealing, especially as a member of the cross-party group on fair trade. And I have very active fair trade movements in my constituency. Lenzie is a fair trade nation, fair trade town. Scotland's a fair trade nation. I do not have ambitions beyond independence for Scotland. I have constituents who are working very hard on fair trade. So to put it on the face of the bill actually is quite appealing to me. But then the more I thought about it, and when Alison Johnson was saying it today in her speech, I thought, is that too fixed? Because if we put this on the face of the bill, does that tie us in sustainable procurement to the fair trade brand? So how would we word it in an act? Can I just finish? And if I have time, because what I'm worried about is how we can word in the Act that under the sustainable duty we must look to procurement practices that look at fairly traded products. If we talk about fair trade, we are limiting ourselves to that brand. I'm sorry, Ms Boyer, but I'm really terribly short of time. The other thing that I worry about is, does that fix us too much in time again if we put it actually into statute? Fair trade nation status was fantastic that Scotland achieved it last year, but if we talk about our fair trade nation status, what happens if that moves on as time moves on and that's no longer what we're trying to achieve? So for me, it's very much about guidance and using the guidance to ensure that the sustainable duty also encompasses that using procurement practices that ensure that we use fairly traded products. So if I can leave that with the Cabinet Secretary, as my thoughts on it. And in my last few seconds, I can't help it. As a librarian, I can't ignore what Tavish Scott said. You don't just buy a book and that's what it costs. The cost in purchasing library books is in the title, not the quantity of the books. So we got that totally wrong. But should I be surprised about that? Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. We now turn to closing speeches, and I remind all members who have participated they must be in the chamber. I call on Gavin Brown. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think we've had a useful and interesting debate this afternoon, and the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill is a piece in the jigsaw. It's only a piece in the jigsaw for procurement, but it's a very important piece, and this is an important piece of legislation. The bill itself doesn't do everything. There will be guidance to follow afterwards, which will be important too. But even more important than the bill and all of the guidance and secondary legislation that follows is what happens on the ground once all of those regulations and the bill itself become law. It will be the culture change on the ground across Scotland at procuring authorities that will determine whether we have made a difference or not going forward. I want to pick up on a couple of issues that came through in the debate. And the first one I want to pick up on that a number of members raised. I think it was Malcolm Chisholm who raised it first in an intervention on the Cabinet Secretary, was to do with the size of contracts. Can the contracts that we put out there be unbundled in some way in order to give smaller businesses a greater prospect of getting the contract itself? Now, this is not an easy thing to achieve. Chick Brodie, I think, made that point. Whether you can achieve it easily at all is an interesting question. Whether it can be achieved through legislation is another one. But I think the committee reached the right conclusion that this is an issue that ought to be looked at in greater detail to see if more can be done at stage 2 or stage 3. I think the Federation of Small Businesses once again put forward strong arguments about why it is so important for us to look at it. Small businesses don't want special treatment. They're not looking for favours. What they do want, though, is the ability to compete and to be able to go into contracts with a reasonable prospect of getting it, if indeed they are the best company for that particular job. Now, in response to Cabinet Secretary, and in fairness to her, she did point out a couple of areas where she felt the bill tried to address the issue for small businesses. She correctly referred to section 26, which removes the ability to charge, and she made reference also to section 24, which looks at guidance for tenderers and also how they can be selected. But what I think neither of those sections, nor indeed any other part of the bill does, is actually refer specifically to the size of the contract. There is nothing in the bill, as I can see it, that makes reference to unbundling or even gives the government powers to look at guidance on how contracts might be broken down. It may be too difficult to achieve, but I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to address the point in her closing, and particularly in the written response to the committee, and for the government to do all that it can to see if something additional can be done to give those smaller businesses the opportunity to compete. The second point I want to pick up on was who ought to be included within the scope of the bill, who ought to be deemed to be contracting authorities so far as the legislation is concerned. There is a list, of course, in the schedule to the bill about who is currently included. And I think there were a number of interesting points made about other possibilities. One of them was Scottish Water, a point made by Alex Johnson, but a conclusion also reached by the committee, I understand, without division. They didn't say they must be included. I think the exact phrase was, there is benefit in looking at this, and I certainly concur with that. And I would ask the government to refer specifically to that in their closing if they can. If there are sort of initial views from government, obviously they will have to refer to it in any written response as well. I was interested in the point made by Tavish Scott, initially in an intervention, but obviously during the course of his speech as well. To what extent could Hubco be included in here? To what extent should they be included? Again, where does the government sit in relation to that? Do they have an initial view before they express a final one? We'd be very interested, I think, to hear that. Deputy Presiding Officer, others talked about micro businesses, and again this was put forward strongly by the Federation of Small Businesses, not just for today's debate, but over the last couple of months or indeed years. Could a definition for micro businesses be included within the bill itself? There is, in section 9 of the bill, specific mention of small and medium-sized enterprises. and contracting authorities have to facilitate situations where they have an opportunity to take part. But can we extend this further? Because the issue is often raised is that the term SME includes just about every business within Scotland. I forget whether it's 95% or 99% of businesses, but the point is often made by the FSB that by using that term, it includes anyone up to, I think, 250 employees, which is the vast majority of businesses within Scotland. If you reduce it to micro businesses, we can then track and monitor how those smaller businesses are genuinely faring in terms of the legislation and in terms of the contract. There's one other minor issue I want to pick up on. It's not something I saw in the committee report. It's not any evidence I've seen upon, and it's not something that anyone has made any representation to me on. But just in going through the bill, when we get to the sections 27 onwards, particularly when we start to look at the remedies after that, I think at part 4 of the bill, I do just ask the question about whether we have made it too easy for somebody who's lost out on a contract to go to court. It seems to me to be the case that if they don't get a response that they like within 30 days under Section 28, they then have an automatic right to raise an action through the court, which ultimately could suspend implementation. I'm not saying we've got it wrong, but I'm just asking the question if that, again, can be looked at further to make sure that that doesn't happen. Thank you.
Many thanks. And now Colin Griffin, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And just from the outset, just state that we will be supporting the Procurement Reform Bill at decision time tonight, because we do feel that public sector procurement can achieve much more than the positive effect of that individual contract. We spend well over £9 billion a year on procuring goods and services in Scotland, and we need to see the full economic, environmental and social benefits that that vast sum of money can bring in. The Procurement Reform Bill we have here is that opportunity that Dennis Robertson spoke about to achieve those outcomes. We support the introduction of a public contracts website, which will improve access to contracts for smaller companies by introducing that single point of information. But like others who have mentioned in the debate, Malcolm Chisholm, Sarah Boyack and Gavin Brown, that we would like to see more work done on debundling contracts into smaller lots to allow those smaller companies based in Scotland to be able to benefit from public spending that they're currently missing out on. We also support the introduction of procurement strategies and annual procurement reports. That should help to improve the procurement performance of a public authority, but should go further in line with recommendations from the Project Management Institute touched on by Chick Brodie to ensure that contracting authorities and contractors take project management best practices into account and include a provision for job classification and career paths for project managers and procurement officers, so that public authorities then start to build and retain those skills in procurement and project management. Annual procurement reports containing the summary of the regulated procurements the authority expects to commence in the next 2 years should also help companies plan their tendering exercises more effectively. And the section on ensuring payments to contractors and subcontractors are paid within 30 days is also welcome, as it should give those smaller firms more security and allow better planning. I've spoken about the positive aspects of the procurement strategies and annual procurement reports, but I think there is an element missing there, and that's something that Sarah Boyack spoke about passionately, and that is that there is no requirement in the bill for public authorities to state in their annual procurement statements on which contracts they've awarded to supported business, and I would expect at the very least that there would be a stipulation in those annual procurement reports that authorities could state which contracts were awarded. Further to that, we have a statement, and it's an extract from the foreword from the Scottish Government document on supported businesses, which states that supported factories and businesses have demonstrated that they can provide good value for money to the public sector and public bodies. and public bodies are required by the Scottish Sustainable Procurement Action Plan to make the maximum possible use of reserve contracts for supported factories and businesses. At the very least, every public body should aim to have at least one such contract. Like I said, that was an extract from the foreword from a Scottish Government document on supported business, where the stated aim of that government and this government was echoed by the STUC in evidence to the committee that every public authority should have at least one contract with a supported business. And I look forward to the Cabinet Secretary outlining how she intends to achieve that government aim through this legislation. We also welcome the inclusion of community benefit requirements, but would reflect the views of witnesses to the committee and Cabinet Secretary herself that the limit of £4 million shouldn't stop community benefit clauses being included in contracts below that threshold. We wouldn't want to see companies using that £4 million threshold as some sort of lobbying mechanism against community benefit clauses at contracts below that level. And in line with the committee report, we wait further information from the Scottish Government on how the inclusion of community benefit requirements will be encouraged in contracts of a lower value. On exemptions as well, we welcome the decision by the Cabinet Secretary to lodge amendments at Stage 2 in relation to health and social care contracts. Kevin Stewart stated it eloquently that when it comes to contracts like that, continuity of care is of utmost importance, and I hope the amendments will give the flexibility for authorities to take decisions based on what's best for their service users, rather than a requirement to have to re-tender and re-advertise. Along with the FSB and others who have stated in the debate, Tavish Scott and Alex Johnson, we have to look again at the spending powers of ALIOs and HUBCOs who are not covered by the provisions in the bill, and again, as in the committee report, wait for further information on those issues. The Scottish Government have come a long way on blacklisting under pressure from trade unions and colleagues in the Chamber, and I welcome the publication of the recent Scottish Procurement Policy note with the addition of those questions to the pre-qualification questionnaires. What we would like to see, though, is a specific clause in Section 23 of the bill to make that firm declaration and commitment that blacklisting is unacceptable and will not be tolerated, have that on the face of the bill rather than in guidance. I take Fiona MacLeod's point of view on flexibility, but this isn't an issue of flexibility. We would like an iron-cast commitment on the face of the bill that blacklisting is not acceptable in our public contracts. Finally, Presiding Officer, I come to the main ask of the Scottish Government through this bill, and that is on the living wage. Payment of the living wage is a key measure to reduce in-work poverty, and although the arguments are well rehearsed, we know that the living wage can lead to a healthier workforce with lower sickness absence levels, lower turnover, reducing recruiting costs, and an increase in productivity as well as other benefits. Why then has the Scottish Government failed to use the billions and billions of pounds spent by the public sector every year to ensure workers on those contracts are paid the living wage? We often hear that word transformational being used in the Chamber, but I really believe that introducing that requirement for contractors to pay a living wage on public sector contracts would be just that. The Scottish Government have worked to ensure that staff in their direct employment are paid the living wage. Local authorities have followed there too, but the private sector just hasn't kept up to speed. This bill gives us that opportunity to push those private companies that bid for public contracts and then pass that best practice wider, because of the demand for increased wages, and that will be our key demand for the Procurement Reform Bill as we progress to Stage 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Nicola Sturgeon to wind up the debate. Deputy First Minister, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank everybody who's taken part in this debate? I think it's been, generally speaking, a very good debate. Clearly, I won't have time in 10 minutes to respond to absolutely every comment that's been made or question that's been asked, but we will reflect carefully on all of them as we consider our approach to Stage 2. And can I say at the outset that, generally speaking, I go into Stage 2 of this bill with a very open mind. I don't think I've heard anything this afternoon that I'm not prepared to further consider, and I look forward to those discussions. There's two preliminary points I want to make, then I want to get into some detail on some of the key themes that have emerged from the debate this afternoon. Firstly, the general points. I think there has been a broad acceptance that it is really important that we try to get this right. Procurement spend is one of the most important economic levers that we have. There is a tension that runs right through this agenda, and it's always going to be the case. The tension between, for example, efficiency and cost effectiveness on the one hand, and on the other hand, access, particularly for smaller enterprises and third sector organisations, and community benefits. So it's really important that we try to get the balance right. One particular point that I think is pertinent to the striking of that balance is the points that were made by Gavin Brown, and he's summing up, and Malcolm Chisholm, who's not here just now, but made the point earlier on about size of contracts and the potential for unbundling. Can I say, I'm not sure if there is something we can do in a concrete sense in the bill, but it is one area where I recognise the frustrations of small businesses in particular, and I'm very happy to work with others to see if there is more we can do as we go into the next stage. Second general point is one that's been made by me and by others. This bill is not a panacea. It sits in the broad sweep of procurement reform. I very much agree with Kevin Stewart in the comments he made. Much of what is wrong or perceived to be wrong in procurement can be fixed by a common sense approach to how procurement is done. I think he raised an important point about best practice. The bill is, above all else, about spreading best practice and making it consistent. Maureen Watt was right to refer to the importance of using the public portal and standardised PQQs, and of course the bill is about standardising those examples of best practice. Dennis Robertson also talked about raising awareness, and he's right there. And the publication of contract registers is very important in making sure that businesses have got a clear line of sight of the contract opportunities that are available to them. I want to go in now to some of the more specific parts, and I'll run through as much of the detail here as possible, but apologies if I miss any point that was specifically raised. First area really is the scope of the bill. Maureen Watt, James Kelly, Alec Johnson, Tavish Scott and others raised this. Let me first of all just explain, not trying to have an argument with anybody about this here, but explain the rationale for why some bodies are covered and some bodies aren't. We've, in the interests of simplicity and understanding and avoiding confusion, we've tried to mirror the 2012 regulations. So Scottish Water is not covered by this bill because under EU legislation it's covered by different directives. Utilities generally are covered by different directives. Hubcos are not covered because they're not public bodies. They're partnerships awarded after European-wide competition. And one of the benefits of Hubcos is the flexibility they then have in the awarding of further contracts. ALIOs, whether they're included or not, will depend on the status of the ALIO. If they are a public body, they will be. If they're more aligned with the Hubco model, they won't be. Scotland Excel is covered by the bill and will therefore be subject to the sustainability duty. So that's the rationale. But I, as I say, am open-minded to further discussion about this, and whether that is about bringing bodies that are not currently within the bill into the bill, or perhaps more pertinently about encouraging those bodies that are outside the bill to give commitments to voluntary compliance with the principles in the bill. Briefly, if you don't mind, because I've got a lot to get.
Just very quickly, I very much agree with that answer she's given. Does that mean there's no legal impediment in that sense to Hubcos being brought within the confines of the bill?
In general terms, that would be right, although there will be different issues applied to different bodies. Can I turn now to the living wage raised by a number of members? This is not a debate, certainly not between Labour and the SNP benches, about the principle of the living wage. And sometimes, the comments have made it sound as if it is.
We cannot make the living wage a requirement of contracts under European law. That's not because we haven't asked the right question. Members have had the opportunity to see the letter from the relevant European Commissioner. But I would have hoped all members would have welcomed the fact that we are not, on the government benches, prepared to accept that we cannot do anything about promoting the living wage through this bill. So the bill gives us the power to issue guidance on the workforce matters that contracting authorities can take into account, which would include, where relevant to the performance of the contract, the living wage. So I, again, would hope that we can unite around what we can do through this bill, while continuing to challenge ourselves to see if we can do more, rather than appear to be having a debate about the principle when actually we agree on the principle. And for those who have talked about what happens if guidance is ignored, I would refer them to section 24(3) of the bill, which states contracting authorities must have regard to guidance issued under this bill. Let me turn quickly now to blacklisting. I like a good argument as much as anybody, but I would encourage Neil Findlay to recognise when people are actually trying to agree with him. And that was the case on blacklisting. There is a clause in the bill that enables us to deal with blacklisting. It's section 23. That provision enables us to produce regulations that would cover the circumstances in which a company could be excluded from bidding for contracts, for example, when they've avoided tax or when they've committed grave professional misconduct. And in the regulations, we would seek to make it clear that blacklisting would be an example of grave professional misconduct. So again, this is an area where we build on the guidance that's already been issued and launched by the STUC and the First Minister, and I would put on record my thanks to the trade unions with whom we continue to work to put into practice our joint determination to stamp out the abhorrent practice of blacklisting. Let me turn now to community benefit clauses. Mary Fee, Sarah Boyack, Jackie Bailey, others made points about the threshold, and let me just respond with a few comments on this. Firstly, just to say how we arrived at £4 million. It broadly mirrors the level set in the EU regulations for public works contracts, and it is in recognition of the fact that the evidence says that larger contracts lend themselves better to meaningful, impactful community benefit clauses. But I'm not fixed on £4 million. So, I'm more than happy that we have a debate about that at stage 2, whether that's £2 million, £3 million, £4 million, £5 million. There's not an issue in principle there. It's about where we think the level is best set. But the next point I would make that is probably the most important point is that wherever we set that level, we are not saying that contracts beneath that level shouldn't have community benefit clauses. It is simply setting a level above which the bill mandates those clauses, and we must never give the impression that contracts below that level are somehow exempt from doing the right thing in terms of community benefit. In the 2 minutes I've got left, I'll just run through a number of smaller, not smaller in the sense of importance, but smaller in terms of the number of people raising them, issues that were raised. A number of members, Linda Fabiani, Fiona MacLeod, Alison Johnson, raised the very important issue of fair trade. There were some disagreements emerging between, particularly Fiona MacLeod, I think, and some others. There are some tricky legal issues involved here. There are also, as Fiona MacLeod, I thought, articulated very well, some practical issues involved here. But can I say that I've listened carefully to the points made today, and we will continue to engage very closely with the Scottish Fair Trade Forum to try to find the best ways possible of strengthening the bill in this regard. Supported businesses. Chick Brodie, Sarah Boyack, Mark Griffin raised the suggestion that every public authority should have at least one contract with a supported business. That is an aspiration I 100% support. Including that in the bill wasn't supported through the consultation that we did, but I'm happy to consider that further at stage 2. As members are aware, we're already raising awareness of supported businesses through the framework agreement we've already got in place, and we're having some success there, but it is really important that we keep our foot on the pedal. Finally, there were some comments made about the general duties, Section 8 and Section 9 in particular. I think Stuart Stevenson and Alison Johnson in particular raised some very particular points about the wording of Sections 8 and Section 9. I'm happy to consider those points in more detail and come back at stage 2. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I think there's been a lot of food for thought. I take heart from the fact there is broad support for this bill and the balance it strikes. But as we go into stage 2, some of these more detailed and specific points will certainly merit further debate.
That concludes the debate on stage 1 of the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. We now move to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion number 8677 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. And I call on John Swinney to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 9051 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8677 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting.